Yo, what's up, history fans? So, picture this. It's the early 1400s, and China's got this massive fleet of treasure ships sailing all the way to East Africa, trading with African kingdoms decades before Europeans even knew how to get there. We're talking about Admiral Zheng He, a Muslim eunuch who commanded the largest naval expeditions in history. This is the incredible story of when China and Africa connected, and how it all got forgotten. Let's dive right in. Chapter 1. Zheng He and the Treasure Fleet. All right, so crimson sails entered these treacherous waters, a narrow passage hemmed on each side by the green coast of Sumatra and the Malay Peninsula. Few sailors dared to go through here, but these colossal Chinese ships waded forward anyway, adorned with these menacing carvings of dragons and phoenixes. Pretty badass. Admiral Zheng, he was leading the imperial fleet back to China when the dreadful pirate fleet of Qin appeared before him. Qin had been plundering and extorting passing vessels for years, and these Chinese visitors were sailing into his waters heavy with cinnamon, pepper, and other precious foreign goods, basically floating treasure. Zheng He pulled ahead with a small group of ships and then turned to draw the pirates out. Classic bait and switch. The imperial ships then spun close, and men on deck rallied to their positions and sprayed burning streams of gunpowder onto the pirate vessels. Incendiary projectiles devoured their sails, and the inferno consumed 10 pirate ships just like that. Zheng He cruised through the wreckage, hunted for Qin for months, captured him, and sailed back to the elegant capital of Nanjing, China. Qin was beheaded, and Zheng He was received by the emperor with serious praise because he delivered gold, silk, and blue-white porcelain to courts of faraway lands, and returned with goods and envoys from India, Malacca, and Sumatra. The Chinese interpreted this exchange of fine goods as foreign acknowledgement of the emperor as the rightful ruler of the world. So diplomacy and commerce basically legitimized the reign of the Yongle emperor, who'd only gotten the throne through a bloody civil war that overthrew his nephew. At his side since he was a young prince had been the loyal Zheng He, whose father had been killed when Ming armies made war against the Mongol tribes of the north, remnants of the fallen Mongol Empire that once ruled China. Zheng He had been captured, castrated, and sent to serve as a royal eunuch. Dark origins for such a legendary figure. Now the Yongle emperor ordered his intrepid friend on another expedition across the seas. In Java, they observed the Hindu practice of sati, the live burning of widows. In India, they saw magnificent temples, elephants, and men of many faiths. Zheng He was himself a Muslim, born in a China whose beliefs derived primarily from Confucian, Taoist, and Buddhist traditions. The vast Islamic world had spread its teachings far, sending scholars, explorers, and roving traders to distant lands. It was on those very trails that China perceived echoes of a farther world, Africa. Nearly 7 centuries before, in 751, a Chinese soldier was taken prisoner in a battle against the Abbasid Caliphate and then allowed to explore. He wrote about crossing south from Jerusalem and described a place called Mulan, likely North Africa. The people there are black and their customs are bold. Chinese cities hosted Arab trading colonies where merchants would unpack rhinoceros horn, frankincense, and rare spices, goods from Islamic-settled East Africa. These Islamic states also began raiding the African interior for people, and the Arab slave trade moved Africans to Iraq. Over the centuries, a handful of these enslaved Africans came to China as captives of Arab traders. Others were sold into servitude in Chinese households. But here's the thing. The terrible treatment of these enslaved people didn't diminish Chinese respect for free Africans. In the late 11th century, the Song Emperor actually prepared this ornate procession of royal boats to receive a delegation of African traders, gifted them white gold, and asked about their country. Commerce carried information. Medieval Chinese merchants, the most daring of whom had themselves traveled to Africa, passed along stories of brave nomads loyal to their chiefs and warring clans who roamed a country that shook with giant creatures. By the 13th century, a customs inspector on the Chinese docks had gathered descriptions of this place consistent with East African folklore. He wrote that in Africa, many people practice magical arts and can change themselves into birds, beasts, or sea creatures to frighten and delude foolish commoners. If in their business dealings with a foreign ship a grievance arises, they cast a spell to bring the ship to a standstill. So from the travels of audacious merchants grew this mythos. Peculiar stories of kingdoms and spellcasters at the far end of the sea. Pretty wild stuff. Chapter 2. The Voyages to Africa. Now came the days of the Ming Dynasty, and Admiral Zheng He would lead this awakening of Chinese naval power. In 1414, as hundreds of ships and 30,000 men sailed to India and beyond, part of Zheng He's fleet returned to the Yongle Emperor with a gift from the King of Bengal, a giraffe. The wise men of the court said this beast was a legendary qilin, by whose mystical footprint the great Confucius had supposedly been conceived in ancient times. They described it as a qilin whose shape was as high as 15 feet, with the body of a deer and the tail of an ox, and a fleshy, boneless horn. Gentle as this animal that in all antiquity has been seen but once. It seemed like this creature from a higher realm had crossed into the mortal plane to shine as the first light of a new and prosperous age. Obviously, this was just a giraffe from the eastern coast of Africa, but the symbolism was huge. A year later, Zheng He returned with the main fleet. In his western voyages to grand Islamic cities, he'd met many esteemed Africans. So he came to the Yongle Emperor with another qilin and ambassadors from the African city-state of Malindi. Within a year, envoys from Mogadishu and Brava also came to the imperial courts. The meeting of these distant powers consisted of an exchange of gifts, diplomatic gestures, and the emperor's promise to transport his visitors home. So Zheng He prepared his fleet, returned to the shimmering palaces of India, and advanced to the court of the Sultan of Aden. All the while, Zheng He consulted the stars for direction and pored over this 21-foot map that roughly charted the coast ahead. White flocks of tiny dhow ships parted before the hulking Chinese treasure ships. Weary sailors, officers, and translators climbed into the city streets under the shade of towers and palm trees. From tall lime and coral houses, men came with abundant goods. Women passed in vibrant scarves and dresses, and children stared at this procession of foreigners. This was Africa. The city of Mogadishu was a metropolis of Somali and Swahili-speaking people, tracing their origins to inland Africans and Arab settlers. They lived under the Ajuran Sultanate, a wealthy network of powerful sheiks who cultivated ocean-crossing trade that brought Persian, Indian, and Indonesian merchants to these shores. The Chinese travelers noted the gold earrings of the women. About the arid land around the fishing port, they wrote, "Your eyes rove round to meet only sights and stars of desolation, the whole country nothing but hills. But rare spices and rare beasts evoke a sigh of admiration." Zheng He's men offered cream-colored porcelain, gold satins, rice, and silk, and received myrrh, ivory, and live rhinoceroses, lions, ostriches, and zebras. These locals were no doubt wary, because a Chinese fleet looked like a floating city armed with the largest ships on Earth. Zheng He had earlier mobilized his power to actually dethrone and replace a king in Sri Lanka who turned away his trading mission. So they knew these guys weren't playing around. The fleet continued south to the smaller settlements of Brava and Xyla, and they likely traded with nomadic clans and sailed to the kingdom of Malindi and the great trade center of Mombasa. If the whole world already belonged to the emperor, he had no need to conquer what he already owned or wage unnecessary war against those he considered subjects. This was an age of diplomacy. Arab, Indian, and African envoys joined a parade of soldiers, giraffes, and nobles to the marvelous center of the newly constructed Forbidden City. Glowing paper lanterns lined the path, and fireworks scattered light over the moats. The Yongle Emperor greeted them, read from royal scrolls, and beheld this city, the new northern capital of his rising empire. But soon the fleet sailed again to Africa, and the emperor sensed the heavens were turning against him. Lightning struck the Forbidden City and burned several wings. Famine starved the countryside, and on the northern edges of his country, raiding Mongols overtook the land. The old emperor rallied his armies to hunt them, and on the long campaign he died of illness. His successor would criticize his voyages as frivolous and costly. Scholar officials voiced Confucian disdain for foreign affairs and warned about the ambitions of influential eunuchs like Zheng He. This emperor died after 9 months on the throne and was succeeded by the Xuande emperor. In 1431, he summoned Zheng He, now in his 60s, for another voyage. So departed the great fleet, divisions of which returned to familiar ports of Asia and, after a decade of silence, sailed into the bustling harbors of Africa. There, People drank from Ming pottery, adorned their mosques with Chinese porcelain, and draped themselves in Eastern silk. Chinese and European maps would later have details suggesting the fleet ventured far south to trade with the peoples of now Tanzania and perhaps southern Africa and Madagascar, which was already settled by Indonesians. This was the final voyage. It's thought that Zheng He passed away from illness on the way back to China. His body pointed toward Mecca and buried at sea. Oyutiaro. At the end of that century, Vasco da Gama led the Portuguese around the southern tip of Africa. The Portuguese would sack and forcibly settle parts of the eastern coast. Africans who'd seen the Chinese treasure fleet found European ships and goods totally unimpressive. The palace gates of China shut, and her seas fell back into piracy. A court official destroyed or hid Zheng, his official travelogues, and the voyages were forgotten. Along the East African coast today, there are villagers who claim descent from shipwrecked Chinese sailors, and you can still find faded shards of Chinese porcelain and coins, remnants of this golden age when China and Africa connected. Pretty incredible lost history. Stay curious, everyone. Peace out.